We're back with another race weekend in the long-awaited Chinese Grand Prix. With so many cancellations, we're finally getting it in these new regulations. And this track is full of history and fun moments and could be quite the exciting one. Chinese Grand Prix holds the record for the most amount of overtakes in a dry race with 161 overtakes. To put into perspective, the Dutch Grand Prix we had in 2023 had 186, and that was a half wet, half not, so a bit more of a skewed number. But 161 in one race is an absolutely ridiculous feat. But one of the best overtakes in the Chinese GP was when Vettel overtook two cars in the pit lane with a brilliant way of doing it, staying within track limits, and a moment that nobody's ever going to forget. Speaking of Vettel, he gave us also another one of those infamous lines of Danny Kvyat's torpedo moment going into turn one.
You asking what happened at the start. If I don't go to the left, you crash into us and we all three go out.
Well, I was...
No, not well. You came like a torpedo.
Well, it's racing.
I'm racing, but...
Which is why also the Chinese GP has the craziest turn one and its insane moments around it. The torpedo one is definitely a moment not to forget and quite a funny one. Michael Schumacher had his last win here in 2006 before going to Mercedes. He didn't end up winning anything there, but awesome to note from the legend himself. Another crazy moment, and something probably nobody's going to forget, is when Sebastian Buemi lost his wheels just going down the straight, and a Formula One car doing something that I think we will never see again, which is losing both of its front wheels and just popping off the car. It was a ridiculous moment, and somehow the Chinese GP holds this as well. This Grand Prix offers a lot of fun. The layout is much different to any other track. There's a lot of overtakes on the back straight, but you still need a lot of high downforce. And it requires a very efficient style throughout the lap to be very consistent because tire wear is very high here as well. Going over the compounds and what we should expect here, we're going from a C4 to a C2, which honestly I didn't expect. I thought we'd go from a C3 to a C1 because the tire stress here is pretty high at a 4 on here. Traction's about a 3, could be even down to a 2, especially with the cold conditions we're going to be getting for this weekend. It's possible we might get rain, so we might see even higher downforce on these cars and maybe different rear wings brought to the cars. So the downforce level might go from a 3 to a 4, but track evolution is huge here. So when you put in your first lap in qualifying, and especially because we have the sprint qualifying this weekend, which means we have a practice one, which goes into the sprint shootout. And then on Saturday, we start actually with the sprint race and then go into qualifying, where they can actually change the setup after the sprint going into qualifying, and then the race in Parc Fermé is actually broken, which is a very nice addition that they can actually change their setup and we could have a different looking race as well as the sprint. It'll be very interesting to see how teams set up their cars from the first sprint going into the bigger part of the weekend. The number of laps is 56, and still the lap record holder is Michael Schumacher with a 132 in 2004. As I talked about with the layout, it's very unique, so let's go over a lap in the Chinese Grand Prix. Starting off, we go in the main straight, which is the DRS zone here, and there are two of them. Overtaking into turn one will happen a lot. This is where the infamous torpedo moment happened with Daniel Kvyat and Sebastian Vettel, how he got himself onto the podium, and quite a funny moment. But this turn one is known to be the hardest and the craziest turn one on the Formula One calendar. It's because of how long this corner is, and the minimum speed you gotta carry here is very interesting. The lines that you take differentiate depending on whether it's wet or dry. And drivers throughout the race going from high fuel to low fuel will take different lines going into here because of the downforce levels and how tricky turn 1 to 2 to 3 really is. No other race has it like this, especially with this layout. It's quite odd, but then 4 and 5 is the end of Sector 1. This is pretty much flat out. Going into 6, which is the start of Sector 2, that hairpin is also a low speed corner, which then gets into, I guess, a medium/high speed section where McLaren could be better, but this track is going to be hell for that team. Turns 7 to 8, you can pretty much take them at full force. But then you have a hard braking zone going into 9 and 10, and this is where it gets very tricky in this lap. And this ends off Sector 2, going into turns 11, 12, and 13. A lot of moments where the rear tends to step out onto the car, It's a very tricky traction zone, especially because of the track evolution here. As I said, throughout the race, it's going to be different lines of drivers going through, especially 11, 12, and 13, and 1, 2, and 3, because of how it's set up. Going through this tricky traction zone, it's very important that the exit you get is phenomenal, because going from 13 to 14 is one of the longest straights on our calendar year. And here we'll have another DRS zone. Now the slipstream here is super strong, especially with the downforce levels. We're going to see plenty of overtakes here. And it goes into a very hard braking zone. This is where Daniel Ricciardo really strives. I hope to see a more revived version from the Honey Badger. That was also when the cars were lighter, so I want to see how these full-out downforce monsters perform here. But turns 15 is pretty easy. It's pretty much flat out. After 14, not really much of a turn. But 16 can be tricky, and I think we're going to see a lot of track limits going into 16. You have to keep a lot of speed going into that straight again to try and perform an overtake. But qualifying laps will be very interesting here, and we'll see who gets track limits and who doesn't. Experience will play a very key part, and you'll see that in my predictions when I speak about who I think is in the top 5, the best and the worst teams. So let's get into the predictions part of this video. Let's start off with what I think are going to be the best teams here. It's a very tricky track, and some cars that have been performing pretty well in this season I think will not perform well here. And the best teams are going to be Red Bull, Ferrari, and I think Aston Martin is going to be a key player here as well. It's going to be a toss-up between Mercedes and Aston Martin, because some parts of this track is really good for the Aston, some part is really good for the Mercedes. They're going to be in that kind of no man's land, and I think Ferrari and Red Bull will be very close, and I'm talking about extremely, extremely close. The front graining on this track is huge, tire evolution is huge here as well, and we do know from race pace that the Ferrari car is really strong and has that superior tire advantage as of right now. It's not by much, but it's enough to give Ferrari enough confidence to push towards the end of the lap. They've been a little lenient on their rear wing, and I think the confidence there is still a bit tarnished from last year, because obviously they were a butter shredder last year, but this year they're much better. So I think we'll have to see what they go with the rear wing and whether it's wet or dry, but Ferrari will be very strong here. As for the worst teams, well, we got to go with the boat. Alpine is definitely going to be the worst team here. Car just continues to have horrible understeer. Turns 1, 2, and 3 are going to be a nightmare for that team. I actually think the Williams car is going to be the second worst team here, and I'm going to put them in. Do I think they're going to be the third worst team? Maybe not, but I think McLaren is going to really struggle here. I think Racing Bulls and possibly even Haas could be better than them here. If there was a track with disadvantages, this is your McLaren track, but the car is still strong. Don't get me wrong. I do think this is going to be a very weak track for McLaren, unfortunately. Even Andrea Stella talking about that this is a race with damage limitation, and it is a track layout for hell for McLaren. Now let's talk about my top 5 drivers going into the weekend. At number 5, I'm going to put Fernando Alonso there. I think he's going to beat out the Mercedes drivers and have a very strong weekend in a car that's performing a lot better now in race pace with the new upgrades added to it. Now, the top 4 are going to be occupied by the Red Bull team and Ferrari, but in what order am I going to put them? Well, we've had quite interesting drives from Carlos Sainz. I think this is going to be the weekend that Leclerc beats him out. So I'm going to put 4 Sainz. I'm going to put at 3 Perez, at 2 Leclerc, and I'm going to put Max Verstappen at 1. It's going to be the little differences that matter in the race, specifically from these top 2 teams. That's where it's going to matter most, especially towards the end when tire degradation is really going to kick in. And I think we're going to have a proper battle. Something like Australia, it should be much closer, not like a Japan, because the high-speed corners is where Red Bull's always had the high advantage. I hope you guys have enjoyed this everything we need to know about the Chinese GP track preview / predictions. If you did, give it a like. Go ahead and subscribe. It would mean the world for me, and peace.